The F-16 Fighting Falcon sat dead on the tarmac like a wounded bird, its engine compartment exposed to the harsh Nevada sun. Major Katerina Ghost Volkov stood beside the aircraft, her weathered flight suit bearing the scars of 1,000 sorties, watching as yet another mechanic threw down his tools in frustration. The engine that had brought her home from 3 combat deployments now refused to turn over, its secrets locked away behind a wall of electronic mysteries that had stumped the base's best technicians for 6 days straight. "Ma'am, we've tried everything." Senior Airman Rodriguez wiped grease from his forehead, leaving a dark smear across his brow. "The diagnostics show green across the board, but she won't start. It's like the engine knows something we don't." Ghost's steel-gray eyes fixed on a figure hunched over a maintenance manual in the corner of the hangar. The recruit had been there for hours, ignored by the other mechanics, scribbling notes in margins that weren't supposed to exist. Nobody knew her name. She'd arrived 3 weeks ago with transfer papers so classified that even the base commander only glanced at them before signing. The other airmen called her silent because she never spoke unless spoken to. And even then, her responses came in measured, careful words that revealed nothing about her past. "What about her?" Ghost nodded toward the corner. Rodriguez followed her gaze and snorted. "The Ghost? She's just a parts runner, ma'am. Fresh out of tech school, probably doesn't know a fuel injector from a coffee filter." But Ghost had been watching. She'd seen how Silent's fingers traced the aircraft's skin with the reverence of someone who understood the soul of machines. How her eyes tracked every diagnostic test with an intensity that spoke of deeper knowledge. How she winced when the other mechanics forced connections that shouldn't be forced. The afternoon light streaming through the hangar's open doors caught the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars. Ghost Squadron Patch, a silver falcon diving through storm clouds, seemed to shimmer on her left shoulder as she made a decision that would change everything. She walked across the hangar floor, her boots echoing against concrete that had absorbed the dreams and frustrations of countless aviators. "Recruit," Ghost's voice carried the authority of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. Silent looked up from her manual, revealing eyes the color of midnight storms. "If you can fix this engine," Ghost paused, glancing at the skeptical faces surrounding them, "I'll break protocol." The hangar fell silent except for the distant whine of jets on the runway. Silent closed her manual slowly, her calloused hands betraying more experience than her personnel file suggested. She stood with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being underestimated, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she smiled. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hangar as base personnel began to gather, drawn by an inexplicable sense that something significant was about to unfold. Ghost's challenge hung in the air like the scent of aviation fuel, heavy with possibility and consequence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with the routine chatter of a military base going about its daily business, unaware that the next few hours would become legend. Silent walked toward the F-16 with the confidence of someone who had been waiting her entire life for this moment. Her hands moved to the engine compartment with surgical precision, and as she began to work, the gathered crowd realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The recruit they had dismissed as insignificant was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful engines come in the quietest packages. Rodriguez stepped closer, his earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity. "What's she doing that we haven't tried?" he whispered to his team lead, but received only a shrug in response. The other mechanics formed a loose semicircle around the aircraft, their arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable failure that would confirm their assumptions about the silent newcomer. Ghost remained apart from the crowd, her trained eye cataloging every movement Silent made. There was something familiar about the recruit's technique, a methodology that spoke of advanced training and real-world experience. The way she bypassed the standard diagnostic protocols and went straight to connections that weren't in any manual suggested knowledge that came from places darker than technical school. The base's afternoon routine continued around them, supply trucks rumbling past the hangar doors, maintenance crews servicing other aircraft, the constant background hum of military efficiency. But inside Hangar 7, time seemed suspended as Silent's hands moved through the engine compartment with the precision of a surgeon and the intuition of an artist. She didn't consult manuals or diagnostic equipment. Instead, she listened to the machine with an intensity that bordered on the mystical. Minutes passed like hours. The crowd grew larger as word spread through the base that something unprecedented was happening in Hangar 7. Officers began to appear at the edges of the group, their rank insignia catching the afternoon light as they craned their necks to see over the enlisted personnel. Even Colonel Matthews, the base commander himself, materialized near the hangar entrance, his weathered face betraying more interest than his position typically allowed. Silent's movements became more focused, more deliberate. She removed a component that none of the other mechanics had touched, examined it with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical realm, and then did something that defied conventional wisdom. She began to disassemble parts of the engine that the technical manuals explicitly warned against disturbing without factory authorization. The hangar held its collective breath as Silent worked with tools that appeared from nowhere, her technique suggesting familiarity with systems that weren't supposed to exist on standard F-16 engines. Ghost's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The recruit's personnel file might be classified, but her skills were writing their own story in the language of hydraulics and electronics. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the hangar floor, Silent's work reached a crescendo. She made final adjustments with the confidence of someone who had done this before, in places where failure meant more than embarrassment. Her hands moved one last time through the engine compartment, checking connections and alignments with the thoroughness of a professional who understood that lives depended on perfection. Then she stepped back from the aircraft and looked directly at Ghost for the first time since accepting the challenge. Her eyes held depths that spoke of missions that would never appear in official records, of knowledge earned in theaters of operation where silence was the difference between success and catastrophe. Without saying a word, she gestured toward the cockpit with a slight nod that conveyed absolute confidence in her work. Ghost moved toward the F-16 with the measured pace of someone who had learned to expect disappointment but hoped for miracles. She climbed into the cockpit with practiced efficiency, her hands finding familiar controls as naturally as breathing. The instrument panel came alive under her touch, displays illuminating in the familiar green glow that had guided her through countless missions in hostile skies. Her fingers found the engine start sequence, muscle memory guiding her through procedures she could perform blindfolded. The crowd pressed closer, their skepticism warring with curiosity as Ghost initiated the startup protocol. For a moment, nothing happened, just the usual electronic sounds of systems coming online, the soft whir of gyroscopes spinning up to speed, the gentle hum of computers running through their self-diagnostic routines. Then, with a sound like controlled thunder, the F-16's engine roared to life. The hangar erupted in cheers and applause as the Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan spun up to idle power, its familiar whine filling the space with the music of successful aviation engineering. Ghost's face broke into a grin that transformed her usually stern features, while the mechanics who had spent days failing to solve the problem stood in stunned amazement. But Silent didn't join the celebration. Instead, she quietly began collecting her tools, her expression unchanged by the success that had just vindicated her against all expectations. She moved with the same deliberate precision that had characterized her work, as if fixing impossible problems was simply another day at the office for someone with her particular set of skills. Ghost shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, her boots hitting the hangar floor with authority that now carried the weight of fulfilled promise. She walked directly to Silent, who stood apart from the celebrating crowd like a shadow that preferred the edges of illumination. The two women faced each other across a distance that seemed to span years of experience and secrets that couldn't be shared in ordinary conversation. "What's your real name?" Ghost asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to know. Silent looked around the hangar at the faces still buzzing with excitement and disbelief, then back at Ghost with eyes that held the weight of classified operations and buried histories. For a long moment, she seemed to weigh the consequences of revelation against the promise that had been made in front of witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their careers. "Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Cypher Petrov," she said quietly, her voice carrying the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second language in places where multiple identities were a survival skill. "Russian Air Force, transferred under Protocol 7. The hangar fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried a different quality, the hushed respect accorded to revelations that change everything. Ghost's expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and finally, understanding. Protocol 7 was a ghost story whispered among intelligence officers, a rumored exchange program for defectors whose knowledge was too valuable to waste and too dangerous to acknowledge. Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier mockery replaced by the wide-eyed wonder of someone who realized he had been in the presence of living legend without knowing it. "You're the pilot who brought the Su-57 out of Moscow," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the hangar's background noise. Cypher nodded once, a slight movement that confirmed what everyone present was beginning to understand. They weren't just witnessing the repair of an aircraft. They were seeing the emergence of a ghost who had walked away from everything she knew to bring her knowledge to the side of freedom. Her silence hadn't been shyness or inexperience. It had been the careful caution of someone whose very existence was a classified operation. The crowd began to disperse slowly, each person carrying with them the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Word would spread through the base like wildfire, but it would be filtered through the understanding that some stories were too important to tell carelessly. The mechanics returned to their other duties, with new respect for the quiet recruit who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. Ghost remained with Cypher as the hangar emptied, the two women standing beside the F-16 that had served as the catalyst for revelation. The afternoon light streaming through the open doors had shifted to the golden hue of late day, painting everything in warm tones that softened the hard edges of military life. In the distance, jets continued their routine operations, the sound of Freedom's engines providing a constant reminder of the mission that brought them all together. "How long since you've flown?" Ghost asked, her tone carrying the understanding of one pilot speaking to another. Cypher's expression softened slightly, revealing hints of the longing that lived beneath her carefully maintained composure. 8 months, 2 weeks, 4 days, she replied with the precision of someone who had been counting each moment of exile from the sky. "Not since I brought the felon across the Bering Strait with your Navy's fighters as escort." The weight of sacrifice hung between them, the understanding that Cypher had given up not just her country and her identity, but the thing that defined her most fundamentally, her place in the sky. Ghost recognized the hunger in her eyes, the same desperate need that drove all true pilots, the addiction to altitude and speed that no amount of ground duty could satisfy. "The promise I made," Ghost said slowly, "about breaking protocol, I meant it." Cypher turned to face her fully, and for the first time since her arrival at the base, hope flickered in her dark eyes. The careful mask of the defector began to crack, revealing glimpses of the pilot who had once ruled the skies above the Russian heartland in aircraft that represented the pinnacle of aerial warfare technology. Around them, the hangar had taken on the quality of a cathedral, its high ceilings and vast spaces suddenly seeming sacred rather than merely functional. The F-16 sat between them like an altar to the gods of flight, its presence a reminder that some things transcended the boundaries of nationality and politics. In the sky, there were no borders, only the eternal dance between pilot and machine, the primal communion that had drawn humans skyward since the first person looked up and dreamed of wings. Ghost's radio crackled to life, cutting through the moment with the harsh reality of military communication. "Ghost, this is Tower. Colonel Matthews requests your presence in his office, immediate priority." The voice was professional, neutral, but carried undertones that suggested the afternoon's events had not gone unnoticed by the base's command structure. She keyed her mic with practiced efficiency. "Tower, Ghost. Roger that. En route in 5 mics." The radio fell silent, leaving them alone again with the weight of consequences that were about to unfold. Ghost looked at Cypher with an expression that mixed determination with something approaching defiance. "Whatever happens next," Ghost said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had made irreversible decisions before, "you've earned your place back in the sky. I'll make sure of it." Cypher nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further words. The afternoon had changed more than just the status of a broken engine. It had cracked open possibilities that had seemed permanently sealed. As Ghost walked toward the hangar exit, her boots echoing against concrete that had absorbed the dreams of countless aviators, Cypher remained beside the F-16, her hand resting on its wing with the gentle touch of someone greeting an old friend. The base continued its routine around them, but something fundamental had shifted in the air above Nellie's. The sky, which had seemed empty of promise for Cypher, now held the potential for redemption. The silence that had protected her was about to be broken, not by exposure or betrayal, but by the roar of engines carrying her back to the realm where she belonged. Colonel Matthews' office occupied a corner of the base headquarters, its windows offering a commanding view of the flight line, where aircraft of every description sat in neat rows like steel birds awaiting their turn to touch the sky. Ghost stood at attention before his desk, her posture reflecting years of military discipline, while her mind raced through the potential consequences of the afternoon's revelations. Matthews was a pilot's pilot, a veteran of 3 combat deployments whose understanding of aerial warfare had been earned in the unforgiving skies above hostile territory. His office walls bore the accumulated weight of a career, spent balancing the demands of military protocol with the realities of life-and-death decision-making. Photos of aircraft and aircrew created a visual history of American air power, while his desk held the paperwork that kept that power operational. "Major Volkov," Matthews began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to think before speaking, "I've just received a very interesting phone call from Washington. It seems that our quiet recruit has attracted attention from some very high places." Ghost maintained her at-attention posture, but her eyes met Matthews, with the directness of someone who had nothing to hide. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov demonstrated exceptional mechanical aptitude and problem-solving ability. Her successful repair of the F-16 speaks to training and experience that would be valuable to our mission." Matthews leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Katerina, I've known you for 6 years. I've watched you lead missions that others wouldn't attempt, bring home pilots who should have been casualties, and maintain aircraft performance standards that inspire the entire squadron. When you make a promise to break protocol, it's not a decision you make lightly." The weight of history settled between them. Ghost's reputation had been earned in the crucible of combat operations, where hesitation meant death and innovation meant survival. Her call sign Ghost had been earned not through stealth, but through her ability to appear in impossible places at crucial moments, delivering ordnance with surgical precision or providing cover when all seemed lost. "Sir, with respect, some protocols exist to maintain order. Others exist to maintain illusions. What I witnessed today wasn't just mechanical competence, it was artistry. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov didn't just fix an engine, she communicated with it in a language that most mechanics never learn." Matthews stood and walked to his window, his gaze fixed on the flight line where jets continued their eternal dance of preparation and mission execution. The phone call from Washington was authorization, Major, not reprimand. It seems that certain people have been waiting for exactly this kind of demonstration. Ghost's posture relaxed slightly, surprise flickering across her features before professional composure reasserted itself. The implications of Matthew's words began to unfold in her mind like tactical possibilities evaluated during mission planning. Authorization suggested that Cypher's presence at Nellie's wasn't the accident it had appeared to be. "Sir, are you saying that Lieutenant Colonel Petrov's assignment here was orchestrated?" Matthews turned back to face her, his expression carrying the weight of classified knowledge that couldn't be fully shared. "I'm saying that sometimes the most important missions begin with mechanics who can fix the unfixable. Your promise to break protocol has just opened doors that some very smart people have been hoping would open for months." The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows across maps and charts that detailed the complex geography of modern aerial warfare. Outside, the routine business of the base continued, but inside Matthew's office, the conversation was reshaping possibilities that had seemed permanently fixed. "What kind of doors, sir?" Matthews returned to his desk and opened a file that bore classification markings Ghost recognized as being well above her clearance level. The kind that lead to test programs that don't officially exist, involving aircraft that haven't been publicly acknowledged, flown by pilots whose backgrounds are so classified that their existence is a state secret. The pieces began to fall into place in Ghost's mind. Cypher's arrival, her careful invisibility, her demonstration of capabilities that far exceeded her supposed training, all of it had been orchestrated to reach exactly this moment. The broken F-16 had been less a mechanical problem than a test, designed to reveal abilities that could only be demonstrated under specific circumstances. "She's been evaluated this entire time," Ghost realized, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern for the complexity of the operation she had unknowingly facilitated. Matthews nodded slowly. "By the best minds in aerospace engineering and intelligence analysis. Your squadron, Major, has just become home to a pilot whose knowledge of Russian aerospace technology is so complete that it's reshaping our understanding of what's possible in aerial combat." The weight of responsibility settled on Ghost's shoulders like the familiar burden of mission command. She had made her promise to break protocol as an act of faith in a fellow pilot's abilities. Now she understood that her faith had been part of a larger design, orchestrated by minds that thought in terms of national security and technological advantage. "What happens now, sir?" Matthews closed the classified file and looked at Ghost with the expression of someone about to share information that would change everything she thought she knew about her mission. "Now, Major, you're going to help us find out if a Russian defector can learn to fly American fighters well enough to teach us how to defeat the aircraft she used to pilot." The implications of Matthew's words echoed through Ghost's mind like the aftershock of a sonic boom. Cypher wasn't just a mechanic or even just a pilot. She was a living library of tactical knowledge about aircraft and systems that represented America's most significant aerial threats. Her defection had brought with her not just information, but the practical experience of someone who had mastered the cutting edge of Russian aerospace technology. Ghost's understanding of the afternoon's events underwent a fundamental revision. The crowd that had gathered to watch Cypher repair the F-16 had witnessed not just mechanical prowess, but the emergence of a strategic asset whose value couldn't be measured in conventional terms. The quiet recruit who had been dismissed by her peers was about to become the focal point of a training program that would reshape American air combat doctrine. "Sir, what about the security implications? Having a former Russian pilot with access to our systems and tactics." Matthew's expression grew serious, reflecting the weight of considerations that had been debated at the highest levels of government. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov has undergone psychological evaluation and polygraph examination by the best minds in the intelligence community. Her defection wasn't opportunistic, it was principled. She brought us intelligence that prevented a significant escalation in the Arctic theater. The afternoon light continued to shift through the office windows, marking the passage of time that would be remembered as a turning point in both Ghost's career and the larger narrative of international aviation warfare. Outside, jets taxied toward runways that would soon carry them into skies where the knowledge Cypher possessed could mean the difference between victory and defeat. "What's my role in this, sir?" Matthews returned to his chair, his posture reflecting the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "You're going to be her instructor, Major. You're going to teach a Russian fighter ace how to think like an American pilot, how to integrate with American tactics, and how to translate her knowledge into training protocols that will save American lives." The mission parameters crystallized in Ghost's mind with the clarity that came from years of operational planning. This wasn't just about teaching one pilot to fly different aircraft. It was about creating a bridge between two entirely different philosophies of aerial warfare, using Cypher's unique position as someone who had mastered both to forge new tactical possibilities. Ghost stood at attention once more, her posture reflecting the acceptance of a mission that would define the remainder of her career. "When do we begin, sir?" Matthews smiled for the first time since the conversation began, his expression reflecting satisfaction with a plan that had taken months to orchestrate and minutes to implement. "You begin tomorrow morning, Major. And Major," he paused, his tone shifting to something more personal, "the promise you made about breaking protocol, you're about to discover that some protocols were meant to be broken." As Ghost left Matthews' office, her mind was already shifting into mission planning mode. The challenge ahead would require every skill she had developed over years of combat operations, every lesson she had learned about leadership and training, every insight she had gained about the delicate balance between competition and cooperation that defined successful pilot development. The base around her looked the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed. The routine operations that formed the backbone of military aviation would continue, but now they would be overlaid with a mission that existed in the shadows between acknowledged reality and classified necessity. Somewhere in that complexity, she would help transform a Russian defector into an American asset while learning lessons that could reshape the future of aerial warfare. The sun was setting over Nellie's as Ghost walked back toward Hangar 7, where she knew Cypher would still be waiting. The sky above them held the promise of challenges that would test everything they thought they knew about flying, fighting, and the complex loyalties that defined military service. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a partnership that neither of them could have imagined when the day began with a broken engine, and a promise made in front of witnesses who thought they were watching a routine repair. Hangar 7 had taken on a different quality in the evening light, its vast spaces now feeling more like a temple than a workshop. Cypher stood beside the F-16, her silhouette sharp against the aircraft's gray camouflage, her posture reflecting the bearing of someone who had spent years standing ready beside fighters that represented the pinnacle of their nation's technological achievement. Ghost approached slowly, her boots echoing in the near-empty hangar with a rhythm that spoke of decisions made and missions accepted. The day had brought revelations that changed everything they thought they knew about each other, but it had also created possibilities that neither could have imagined when it began. "So," Ghost said as she reached the aircraft, "ready to learn how Americans fly?" Cypher turned to face her, and for the first time since her arrival at Nellie's, her expression carried something that looked like anticipation rather than careful caution. "I have been ready since the moment I crossed the Bering Strait with your fighters as escort," she replied, her accent giving weight to words that carried the depth of sacrifice and hope. The two women stood beside the F-16 as darkness settled over the base, each understanding that tomorrow would begin a journey that would test every assumption they held about loyalty, skill, and the complex art of aerial warfare. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the desert sky, distant points of light that had guided aviators since humans first looked up and dreamed of flight. The broken engine that had started it all hummed quietly in standby mode, its successful repair now just the opening note of a symphony that would play out in the skies above Nevada. Ghost and Cypher had each found something they hadn't expected in the other, not just competence or knowledge, but the recognition that some bonds transcended the accidents of birth and nationality. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of skill and trust that would reshape both their understanding of what it meant to be a pilot in an age where the sky itself had become a battlefield, where the margin for error was measured in microseconds, and the consequences of failure were measured in lives. But tonight, they stood together beside an aircraft that represented the bridge between worlds, ready to begin a mission that would change everything they thought they knew about flying, fighting, and the complex loyalties that defined their service to ideals larger than themselves. The hangar fell silent except for the distant sounds of a military base settling into its nighttime routine. And in that silence, both women could hear the whispered promise of tomorrow's skis calling them home to the realm where they truly belonged. The sun had set on one chapter of their lives, but it would rise on a mission that would test everything they had learned about courage, skill, and the eternal human dream of mastering the limitless blue above.